Shalom Aleichem, friends. We're looking at Sichas, volume 18, the first Sicha of the portion of Pinchas, a Rashi Sicha. As my custom, I'm not doing the entire Sicha. Just a little background to what's happening during this moment in time. After Bilam, the evil prophet, tried to curse the Jewish people, and it didn't work, time and again and again and yet again, he blessed us. He came to the king of Moab and he came up with a suggestion of how, in fact, to cause the downfall of the Jewish people. And he said their God hates promiscuity. Of course, he hates idolatry as well. Let's bring out the Midianite women, and they'll also have them bow down to their idols, and we'll accomplish both things at once. And it worked, unfortunately. Bilam was no idiot, and his hatred was so deep, and he had the inside scoop of what gets God angry at the Jewish people. The Midianites were very happy to acquiesce. They sent out their women. They sent out princesses. The Torah tells us, in fact, one of the women was the daughter of one of the kings of Midian. And they all came dressed, obviously, in an unkosher fashion, an attractive, solicitous fashion. As well, they all had idols around their necks. And in this way, they got the Jews, A, to sin with them, and B, caused them to worship idols at the same time. And there was a tremendous fall for the Jewish people at that time. In general, specifically the tribe of Shimon fell very deeply. The leader of the tribe of Shimon, the Nasi, the leader of the tribe, Zimri, fell prey to this whole frenzy and publicly sinned with a Midianite princess in the presence of Moses, in the presence of the Jewish people. And the Torah tells us that Moses froze because Jewish law doesn't dictate what to do in such an instance. Technically, this is not considered adultery. She's not Jewish, probably wasn't necessarily married. It doesn't really matter. It's just disgusting and immoral and unkosher. As Rambam writes, that being with a non-Jewish woman, even though it's not technically adultery, but it's really much worse because it's disconnecting. It's crossing the line outside the Jewish people. But technically, halachically, there isn't really a ruling what to do because you didn't violate adultery technically. So Moses froze. And meanwhile, as he's freezing, there's a plague. People are dying. This is a public desecration of God's name, a public, act of promiscuity, that, a disgusting level. So Hashem obviously doesn't like it, and people are starting to die in a plague, like flies. Pinchas, Moses' a great nephew, grandson of Aaron, approaches Moses and says, Moses, didn't you teach us this law? That if someone who cohabitates with a Gentile woman, and especially if it's in such a public display, the language is the one who is zealous for God's honor can smite him. Meaning to say that you don't, if you take him to court and bait in and you ask what's the ruling, they're going to say there's no ruling. But if someone is jealous for God's anger, for God's covet, God's honor, he can take him down. There are a few such laws, not too many, in Judaism where it's a rule which is not taught. You don't instruct it as coming from the Jewish court, but if someone acts on it, it's sort of vigilantism, it is appropriate. So Pinchas said to Moses, didn't you teach us that? And in fact, Moses had forgotten that law. Commentary explains why did he forget it? In order for Pinchas to come and be anointed the Kohen, because even though he was a grandson of Aaron, he was not born a Kohen. And when the priesthood was granted to Aaron and his 4 living sons at the time, Pinchas was a living grandson who was not included in that mandate. And all future descendants would be Kohens automatically. Pinchas was sort of left out in the cold. But in fact, as it's explained in other Sichos and in Chassidus, Pinchas had a special role to be appointed Kohen individually by God because of this act of zealotry, which he did, which was very dangerous. It was a total Mesiras Nefesh, a total sacrifice of his own life. He's going out against the leader of a tribe of Shimon when there's a whole mob, acting on this frenzy. And he's also taking down a Midianite princess at the same time. I mean, clearly the risk to his life was pretty much close to 100%. And yet he did it. And God and Moses had told him, the language is, the one who reads the letter should carry it out. You remembered the law, you go ahead and act on it. And Pinchas went ahead and did it. And he went and he smited the couple, both of them together, the leader of the tribe of Shimon, along with the Midianite princess. The plague stopped instantaneously, but not before it took 24,000 Jewish lives. And many Jews were thinking, this guy must be a killer, this Pinchas, he must be just a vengeful person. And Hashem turns around and says, no, I give him my covenant of peace. And he is really a man of peace. And he did this to save their lives and to save the Jewish people. In fact, Pinchas becomes an enactment, becomes a reincarnated, so to speak, or extended in the life of Elijah the prophet, which is why at every bris Elijah the prophet comes. A bris is another instance where we spill blood for the sake of love, for the sake of life. And we actually recite the first 3 or 4 verses from today's Torah portion at every bris, concluding with those words, L'chein emor hineni noisen lo brisi shalom, I give him my covenant of peace. And Pinchas becomes Elijah the prophet who ushers in the future redemption. And this is a big deal in and of itself. He showed total mesiras nefesh, total self-sacrifice. And this is a huge soul and the forerunner of Elijah, as we said, and ultimately ushering in Mashiach's coming. So it's a very big deal with Pinchas. Sad day for the Jews, though. 24,000 people died before Pinchas came and saved the day. However, before these 24,000 people died, there was another loss of life, much bigger loss of life. What was that about? As this whole thing was taking place, Jews were worshiping idols. Now, according to Jewish law, an idol worshiper has to be put to death. Certainly, if they did it by their own free will, there's 2 witnesses, capital punishment. And even though we know that capital punishment was executed very sparingly, it is said that a court that executed once in 7 years, or according to some versions, once in 70 years, considered a murderous court. However, when it's warranted, it's warranted. If the 2 witnesses, the person did this sin willingly, knowingly, without coercion, they are liable for the capital punishment. And that's what happened here. Moses said, this is the last verses of last week's portion, Balak. Moses said to the Jewish judges, I want you to judge the people who did this sin of idolatry and give them the punishment that they deserve, namely capital punishment. And he said to each of the judges, I want you to kill your men. The language is, he said to the judges of Israel, kill your men in plural, who bowed to the idol of Baal Peor. And Rashi explains there that men is plural because each one of the judges was told to judge and execute 2 Jews. So, as it's explained there in Rashi, there are many, many tens of thousands of Jewish judges. The total number seems to be somewhere between approximately 78,000 Jewish judges. I'll show you in a second on the screen. This is based on the fact that when Yisro came with the suggestion that we should appoint judges, he said we should appoint judges for every 1,000, for every 100, for every 50, and for every 10 Jews. If we do the math, it comes out somewhere between 70 and 80,000 judges. And if each one kills 2, there's about 160,000 people killed. It's extraordinary, a tragedy. I mean, figure it out. If there were 600,000 adult males, they just killed about 25% of the adult males of Israel. Big deal. Torah doesn't spell it out clearly, I guess, because it's too painful. But it's pretty clear enough, and it's clearly in Rashi and in the classic oral Torah. Just to show you quickly that the math of the judges, if you take a look, Yisro had said the 600,000 Jews, line 38, we should have judges for every 1,000, for every 100, for every 50, for every 10. So if we have 1 judge per 1,000, that's 600 judges. 1 judge per 100, that's 6,000 judges. 1 judge per 50, that's 12,000 additional judges. And 1 judge for every 10, that's 60,000 judges. So we have a total of 78,600. The Rebbe indicates in the text and in the footnotes that there's various versions in the Rashi, in the Talmud, but approximately that's the number of judges. If everyone is taking out 2, so in line 45, we have 157,200 deaths due to idolatry. In addition to that, we have 24,000 deaths due to the plague, which was due to the adultery and the public desecration of Hashem's name. So this was a bad, very sad moment. You might say that Bilam, as much as he failed with his cursing, but he succeeded in part with his advice. I want to just say parenthetically, and I give this class in my own community, so I base this class on the feedback I get from my own community and our own modern sensibilities. It's hard for us to understand capital punishment for a religious violation. And of course, it's been discontinued since the temple was destroyed and the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, the Jewish the high court was dismantled until Mashiach comes, when it's reenacted. So how do we relate to that? I want to just suggest a simple thought. One of the reasons why the capital punishment was discontinued from when the Jewish court was dismantled, nothing is by accident. Everything is by divine providence. It's partially because we are no longer liable on that level, because we are in a lower level of existence. And therefore, we're not held accountable to the same level. You might say two people could do the same crime. Let's choose a crime that we all agree is terrible. Child abuser. But one person claims insanity, and in fact, he's proven to be insane. The other is a normal person, if you can call a child abuser normal, but he's said to be of right mind. Clearly, this person, we would give him the worst punishment. People would say, throw the book at him. I mean, he's evil. And the other person would give him a pass. We'd try to protect society from him, but we would give him a pass, even though the two did the same thing, but it's two different people. This person is not expected to be on the same level. So with no offense to us, but at the time of the temple, people were on a level, certainly at the time when the Jews were in the desert, they were seeing the presence of God and all the miracles. They were on a level to understand that a violation of a biblical sin, breaking Shabbos, which is among the capital offenses, or in this case, idolatry, adultery, this is something that you can't do. This is something that should have been obvious to them. Whereas post-temple and post-Sanhedrin, the Jewish court was dismantled temporarily till Mashiach comes. Maybe very speedily. In the interim, I guess we're all a little bit insane. We're insensitive, and to us, therefore, it wouldn't be fair. We're insensitive to God's commands, and it wouldn't be fair to hold us to that standard. And you might say Torah gives us a little bit of a pass. It doesn't make these sins less serious. But reality is that there is no such thing as a capital punishment. And many commentaries suggest that this is part of the fact, not just the technical reason that we don't have the authority of the Jewish court, but that too is by divine providence, because we're not held to that standard. A little bit along the similar lines of the fact that someone who's a Tinnik Shenishba, someone who did not grow up in a religious home, is not expected to have the same standard as someone else, and therefore is given respect and looked at differently. Even Maimonides discusses this. So this is just a little bit on an aside, pointing that out. So coming back to, so this is the background. We had these two mishaps. They worshipped idols. There was adultery. There was 170,000 people killed by the court. At the same time, 24,000 people died in the plague. And now we come to the Sicha. The text says that after the plague, God told Moses and Elazar, Aaron's son, to take a census. That's the text. I'll bring it up in a moment. Comes along Rashi and says, this is analogous to a shepherd whose herd of sheep was attacked by wolves. And the shepherd goes out and counts them to know how many are left. Let's pull it up. This is the Sicha is based on text 1. It was after the plague. Hashem told Moshe and Elazar, Aaron's son, this continues in verse 2, to take a census. Says Rashi, the gray box in the middle of the screen, it was after the plague. This is compared to a shepherd whose flock was intruded by wolves and killed some of them from his sheep. He counted them to know how many were left. There's another interpretation which I'm not going to discuss, even though the Rebbe does talk about it in the Sicha. So that's the analogy. It's an interesting Rashi. It looks like a very sweet Rashi. When you're looking at it at face value, Rashi's just explaining, why is there a census? Because we lost people. Just like the shepherd is counting the sheep. He lost so many. It looks very sweet. And that's how most of the commentaries who explain the Rashi explain that entry. Why? What is Rashi trying to accomplish? Because whenever Rashi speaks, there's always a question, what's bothering Rashi? Rashi is not just giving commentary from different sources. He's not a collection of information. He's explaining something that's bothersome to the student studying on the literal text level. What's bothering Rashi? The text says that it came to pass after the plague. They made a census. Say commentaries, say Rashi commentaries. Well, why is there suddenly a census? Aha, there's a census because people died. The shepherd lost sheep. He's got to count them. However, the Rebbe comes and blows that out of the water. And the Rebbe says that can't be what's bothering Rashi. Why not? Because there's an earlier place in Torah where there was a similar thing. There was a plague after the golden calf. And there was a census that followed. And there too, Rashi already explained that we count them because we lost people. And he gives also an analogy of sheep that are missing. Rashi doesn't repeat himself. If he already taught us in the book of Exodus, by the golden calf, the people died from a sin. So God commands that there should be a census taken. And he, in fact, gives the analogy of the sheep who were missing from the herd, who died. So why do we have to repeat it? We already know why there's a census. One might say occasionally Rashi does repeat himself just to jog the memory of the student, but it will repeat himself very briefly. Rashi could have said 3 words, to know how many are left. But not to be so wordy and to repeat the entire analogy with the shepherd. Let's pull up for a moment the Rashi in the book of Exodus. This is in the portion of Kitisa related to the golden calf. And just focusing on the few lines that I've highlighted. This can be compared to a flock of sheep treasured by its owner, which was stricken with pestilence. And when it was over, the owner said to the shepherd, please count my sheep to know how many are left, to make it known that they treasured his flock. So we already know this whole Geschichte. We already know the concept of taking a census when there is a loss of life. Why does Rashi have to repeat it at all? And not just he repeats it, but he repeats it at great length with seemingly the same exact analogy as he brings there. A flock of sheep who suffer losses. Good question. It seems like a simple question, but it's problematic. What's the purpose of this Rashi? It cannot be that Rashi is here to explain the connections of the census to the current events of the plague. We already know it from Exodus. So the Rebbe is going to answer this question by posing another question. The first question is basically that this seems to be a repetition of a Rashi in Exodus. But then the Rebbe says, when you look closely at the Rashi here and the Rashi in Exodus, it's not a repetition. There are a few nuanced changes, but they're very important changes. In both cases, he brings an analogy of sheep, who many of the sheep in the herd are lost, and you count them. However, there are a few important pivotal changes between Exodus and here. Says the Rebbe, it's not a repetition. Those changes are on purpose, and that's why the Rashi is here repeated, because it's not really repeated. It's making a different point. Brilliant. What are the differences? The Rebbe is going to point out that if we take a look in Exodus, over there it says that the sheep died from a plague. In our case, it says the sheep were attacked by wolves. If you respect Rashi the way the Rebbe does, that's not accidental. In fact, to add to that, the source of our Rashi in the Medrash also says that they died from a plague, and Rashi deviates from his source in the Medrash and chooses to say, no, they died from being attacked by wolves. He changes the analogy. Clearly, it's on purpose. And then there are other 2 changes. Let me bring up a little spreadsheet to spell it out. So let's start from the top, though, to bring us to where we are now. So we have in line 3, the verse in the book of Numbers, it came to pass after the plague, Hashem told Moshe to take a census of the Jewish people. Rashi says it came to pass after the plague. Analogous to shepherd, who wolves had entered his herd and killed some, so he counts to know how many are left. The assumption of what's bothering Rashi, meaning according to most commentary, why is there a census taken at this time? And the Rebbe asks 2 questions. Question A, we already know from the golden calf that a census is taken where there's a loss. Why does Rashi repeat this and at great length? And B, why the differences between Rashi in Exodus and Rashi here? Now, what is the Rashi in Exodus? Analogous to a sheep, beloved to their master, who suffer a plague, he asked the shepherd to count them to show his love. I know I misspelled the word shepherd, I think. So what are the differences? Remember what the Rebbe is doing with this. The Rebbe is going to point out that the Rashi here is not a repetition from Exodus because it's different. Now, what are the differences between the Rashi in Exodus and the Rashi here? So we have it on the screen. In Exodus, by the golden calf, on line 29, it says the master requested account. Here it speaks of the shepherd making account. Small difference, but the difference is right there. It's striking. Who's making the count? Who's taking the census? Line 31, in Exodus, it speaks of a plague, a pestilence. And here it speaks of wolves attacking. And as I mentioned, Rashi is deviating by using the word wolves from his own source in the Medrash. And finally, the third difference is that in Exodus, it speaks of the fact that the census is out of love. Rashi says it twice. He loves them, and therefore he wants them to be counted to show how beloved they are, how treasured they are by him. That census is all about love in Exodus. And in our case, it doesn't mention the word love. It just says count them to see how many are left. Says the Rebbe, if you read Rashi carefully in Exodus and you read it here, you don't have the question of repetition. It's not. It's a different analogy. Rashi is doing it on purpose, and that will explain why it's repeated, because it's giving a different message. So the Rebbe explains as follows. When there's two types of things that can happen to a flock of sheep. One is they can die from a plague. It's nobody's fault. There's nothing the shepherd could have done. There's something else. They can be attacked by wolves. Here, the shepherd is somewhat responsible. If he's on guard and he has his stick or whatever it is, he may be able to protect them. There's some culpability. Says the Rebbe, that becomes the difference between the story of Exodus and the golden calf and here. In the story of Exodus, the golden calf, Moses had no culpability. He was on the mountain at the time. You can't blame him in any shape or form. And therefore, in Exodus, the language is, they died of a plague. And the master is the one who requests the count. It's not the shepherd's responsibility. And why does the master request the count? Because he loves the sheep. Hashem is requesting the count because he loves the Jewish people. Because over there, again, the shepherd, the sheep died of a plague. It's not his responsibility. He has no culpability. Whereas in our case, people died, the 24,000 people died, partially because Moses was dragging his feet. He froze. He forgot a law. It took him a while to figure out what to do until Pinchas came, until Pinchas was told to act on it. And in the interim, 24,000 deaths took place. And therefore, it's analogous to the wolves attacking, where there is some culpability for the shepherd. And therefore, Rashi deviates here and says, this is about wolves. And the shepherd is taking the count, not the owner, the master. And it's nothing to do with love. He needs to know how many remain. He needs to know how badly he messed up in terms of his responsibility. Says the Rebbe, it's a whole different thing. And the Rebbe further explains that now that we know that there's a difference between Exodus and here, in terms of who was responsible, we can zero in here too. There were two instances of death. Remember, there was an instance of death first by the judges, who put to death some 170,000 people. And then there was the plague. Now, the deaths of the plague, Moses has some culpability because he froze. He didn't know what to do. He didn't act quick enough. Whereas the 170,000 deaths of idolatry, that's not Moses' fault. That's Jewish law. Says the Rebbe, now we can explain what Rashi wants. Remember, the big question in a Rashi is always what's bothering Rashi. Says the Rebbe, what's bothering Rashi, line 35, is why the Torah links the census to the plague when so many more died due to idolatry. The question that's bothering Rashi is not, why is there a census at this time? There's a census whenever there's a death. There are censuses at all different times in Torah. We already know this from earlier verses and earlier commentary of Rashi. What's bothering Rashi is something entirely different. Why is the census linked to the plague? As the text says, it came to pass after the plague. Hashem told Moshe and Elazar to count the Jews. The plague? The plague was peanuts compared to the deaths that took place one page earlier after the idolatry. Why are we focusing on the plague? You know, think of 9/11. 2,500 people died in the Twin Towers. Imagine somebody is bemoaning the tremendous loss, and somebody else says, yes, and what about the people who died in Pennsylvania? It's sad, but you can't compare. This was a tiny loss compared to this. It's like, why would you focus on that when you could be focusing when something so much more serious has taken place? Similarly here, that's what's bothering Rashi. This is brilliant. Not the way all the Rashi commentators saw this, that Rashi is simply trying to explain why there's a census after a plague. We already know why. What's bothering Rashi is something much more nuanced. Why does the Torah make a point of linking the census to the plague when there was a far greater loss? The plague only lost 24,000 people, sad as it might be, but the idolatry deaths mounted 157,000 plus deaths. That should have been the focus. And Rashi answers it by repeating the analogy of the shepherd, but deviating, as we learned before, that it's not a plague, but it's wolves. It's not the master requesting the count, but it's the shepherd. And it's not about the love, but it's about knowing how many remain, to emphasize the culpability of the shepherd. Hashem is teaching Moshe that he is sort of in some way responsible. He needs to be more careful on shepherding his people. And therefore, this is a different type of census where the focus is on Moses and his culpability. And therefore, this extends itself to line 48, in Exodus, Moses has no responsibility, whereas here in Zimri, Moses has responsibility. And line 52, this answers both of the Rebbe's questions. Rashi is not repetitive. He's making a different point. He's speaking about the culpability of Moses in this census. Whereas in Exodus, it's just speaking about the fact that Hashem, out of his love for the Jewish people, wants them counted. And B, this explains the differences between the two Rashis, because that's exactly the point of the second Rashi. There remains one final question, though, that the Rebbe addresses. And that is, why did Hashem focus the census on the plague? This is line 56. It's all good and fine that this census, as per the verse, linking it to the plague, was focused on Moses' culpability and responsibility rather than Hashem's love for the Jewish people. But in this case, too, there were two problems. There were two sources of death. Why isn't Hashem focused on the other source of death of some 170,000 people out of his love? So the Rebbe says that you might say on a momentary basis, the love was hidden. Hashem loves the Jews, it's true, and he loves them even when they sin, but the sin of what the Jews did at this time, especially being with the Midianite woman, which is considered, as the Rebbe explains, crossing a line outside of Judaism. It's one thing to sin as a Jew, it's another to sort of cross that line outside of Judaism, and it's considered a very serious thing. And you might say temporarily, it's almost like Hashem fell out of love with us. And therefore, Hashem is pointing out, I know you lost 157,000 people because of what you did, and I should be loving you and counting you. I don't love you so much right now. Sometimes even a parent can lose love for a child, at least on the surface level. In essence, you always love him, but on some level, Hashem said, no, you walked out on me. You crossed that line, and temporarily he lost his love. And for the love alone, he may not have ordered a census. He only ordered a census out of Moses' culpability and responsibility. But the Rebbe finishes the Sicha, therefore, by taking a huge lesson, an unbelievable lesson. Took at the bottom of the screen, that even when Hashem isn't loving a Jew, Moses and all of us must take responsibility for him. The Rebbe says, think about this, that Hashem is saying, I'm not going to take a census for my own sake. Right now, I don't love them. They did a terrible thing. And yet, at that very moment, it turns to Moses, the eternal leader of the Jewish people, and by extension to all Jewish leaders, and by extension to all of us, because we all have a little spark of Moses. And he says to Moses, what happened to your responsibility? But wait a minute, Hashem, you yourself said that you don't have the love for them. So what? That doesn't take away Moses' responsibility. And this is very much in line with the Rebbe's thinking of how to look at a Yid, that even if you see a Yid who's not connected to Yiddishkeit, it seems, who maybe crossed the line, You might even decide that that Yid in Hashem's eyes is not so beloved. That doesn't exempt us, the fellow Yid, from loving that Jew. And Hashem expects us to do so, which is very much in line with the Rebbe's approach to a Yid who might be outside of the path of Torah. I think of an analogy in our own family that one of our children was punished. And one day she did something not so good and she was punished. She's not getting the dessert. It was a special dessert. Maybe there was ice cream. And this particular child was excluded from the ice cream. And as the ice cream is being served, her older sibling started to cry. So my wife said, "What's wrong?" And she explained that I'm not going to be able to enjoy my ice cream if my younger sister, Tzivya, is left out. And she cried hysterically. My wife was so touched by that love that she gave them both the ice cream. Sometimes the parent may be angry at the child and upset at the child and punishing them, and they deserve it, and yet they expect the sibling to show love, and that itself exhibits and brings home the love that the parent has to all their children at all times. Similarly, Hashem is upset at the Jews. He doesn't care. 157,000 people don't even bother. But Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, is expected to pay attention and to watch for each and every one, which obviously is the Rebbe's message of obviously strong love for each and every Yid.